the Middle podcast, the podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers, and welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck, and this week, this might be a little bit of a broken record for those who are regular listeners to the show, and either I am over-prepared, the right amount of prepared, or completely underprepared on any given basis, any given week, and I'll be very, very honest. I've mentioned this, I think, once or twice, but I have been grinding at this video game now for literally hundreds of hours, in part because I got about 10, 12 hours in and realized I'd kind of been playing the game wrong, or at least not competently. So it is an RPG. I am currently playing The Witcher 3, The Wild Hunt, and the whole thing is, I bought the Steam Deck. I ended up receiving it, I guess, right around November. I had to do a pre-order months in advance. And it's based on PC technology, except it's a handheld machine, but it actually functions as a PC. In fact, eventually, I do believe that I'm going to set it up to be a secondary PC for me, because ultimately it may offer me more options in terms of audio and visual, so AV stuff for the podcast, because right now I'm using a Mac, and it turned out it has other limitations that I didn't really realize. But nevertheless, I bought the Steam Deck. It comes loaded with Linux as the basic operating system. However, you can install Windows on it. So that's all really mundane and boring and not really the point. But The Witcher 3, I got fortunate enough. I bought it, Black Friday deal, got the original game plus the DLCs. And it just so happens as soon as I got it, within a few weeks, I guess maybe a month of playing, it got a next-gen update, so it leveled up all the graphics, etc. And I have just been grinding away at this game, because with RPGs, there's an awful lot that goes into it as far as building your character, your character's strength, plus there's stories. And I'm currently playing it in what's called Sword and Story mode. So it's basically normal settings, and it has two additional difficulties. One is Sword, so the fighting is much more difficult. Still the same linear story. And there's something called Death March, and Death March is the highest level difficulty that does require a certain level of skill, which I don't think I'll ever have, to be perfectly honest with you, because I know even now I'm still not playing this game all that well. I have considered doing a stream of my gaming, but I realize that actual gamers are going to be like, what the hell are you doing? Why are you so bad at this? So I ultimately haven't pulled the trigger on streaming. I have considered, Twitch, or even putting some things on Patreon, so behind a paywall, because there is other content that I'm interested in that would fall out of the scope of the regular podcast, just things that I'm interested in. So with that in mind, this is not a whatever Wednesday. We'll have another one of those somewhere down the road. Rather, I've been thinking about the things that are, I guess, integral to our generation from a musical perspective. Music is much of what I talk about here on the show, but not always. Last week was sitcoms, for example. And things that are happening even in like the current state of the world. So in 2023, that are legitimately directly tied to our generation. And there are a few things that I find interesting. So this episode is, I have one or two names for it, so we'll decide on what I put up there, which is either musical musings or Old Man Yells at the Clouds, because there are a couple of topics that will go out, I'll talk about that's certainly from the perspective of sounding very much like an old man. So why don't we just jump right into the most recent article that I'm looking at right now, the most recent announcement of the 2023 nominees for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, this has come under some scrutiny as of late, particularly with the 2022 nominations and Dolly Parton being a part of the Rock Hall. And people were saying, this doesn't really make sense because Dolly Parton, by and large, is a country artist. Now, I think it should also be pointed out that I didn't necessarily immediately agree with that assessment, in part because Dolly Parton has pop hits, like truly pop songs that just so happen to be from a Southern country bent. 9 to 5 is a pop song. I mean, it is. And, Islands in the Stream that she did with Kenny Rogers. I mean, that's a Bee Gees penned song. I mean, it's very much, upbeat, almost dance number, right? So I didn't really dismiss the fact that Dolly would have been part of this. But they have made their actual selection and nomination criteria much more specific and clear now, because they do realize there was a little bit of a backlash. And ultimately, anything else, it's a form of commerce, right? So the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is actually brick and mortar, but there's also a lot of attention that comes to it. So you are somewhat beholden to fans of rock and roll music and music in general if you're going to be making what some consider to be arbitrary choices in nomination. So here's the criteria as it's now been dictated by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame CEO, Greg Harris, who says, born from the collision of rhythm and blues, country and gospel, rock and roll is the spirit that is inclusive and ever-changing. And the new mission, which now celebrates the sound of youth culture and honors the artists whose music connects us all. Now, youth culture is really interesting because I'd mentioned on an earlier podcast that youth culture became a thing really in the 60s of being specifically a marketable demographic. Youth, teenagers in particular, because of their at least supposed disposable income. Now, depending on your family background, finances, etc., that's really your parents' maybe not so disposable income, or like many of us, we worked as teens and did buy things for ourselves that were of the entertainment variety. I know for myself, I bought my own comic books and my own CDs and vinyl at one point. Those were things that I bought with my own money because those weren't necessity. Now, some of you just went, wait a minute, music is absolutely a necessity. Yes, for many of us, it's a requirement in our lives to have music. However, that's sometimes a tough sell when you got a single mom who's like, I'm not buying that for you. So just keeping that in mind of what youth culture is. So basically, they've opened it up, and we've already known this. So rhythm and blues. You can say that Elvis, who's the king of rock and roll, was rhythm and blues. He's also country, also gospel. You could say that someone like, I don't know, Chuck Berry, who is also considered one of the forefathers of rock and roll, was playing rhythm and blues. So rhythm and blues and how that's morphed and changed and what we now know as, so R&B, rhythm and blues, is kind of almost, even that has morphed into something different. I think in part because R&B artists, perhaps of the late 80s and 90s, were not always associated with being instrumentalists themselves. I mean, certainly in the disco and funk era, these bands and individual artists who were singers, songwriters, musicians, that kind of morphed into just maybe singers or performers. It doesn't make them any less influential or interesting. New Edition, for example, the boy bands, the New Editions, the New Kids on the Block, what have you. They were all considered kind of under the R&B/pop umbrella, but were they really? So that's just a little bit of how they have reestablished the guidelines for potential nomination and acceptance into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So some of the nominations, or I guess I'm going to read all the nominations because immediately I think you find that the criteria is even more broad. Now, certainly there were a couple of artists who have made it in the Hall the past few years that fall under this particular genre, but that is not clearly laid out in the description that I just read. So here we are, the 2023 nominations for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, some of whom are firmly Gen X artists. First and foremost, we have A Tribe Called Quest. Now, A Tribe Called Quest are legendary, like absolutely legendary. And I think really innovative and were, I think, different than a lot of their peers. So you had A Tribe Called Quest, leaders of the new school, Fushnikins, and then, of course, you had the proliferation and growth of what is commonly known as gangster rap. But these guys were something else altogether. A lot of jazz and freestyle, just really interesting stuff. So, Five Dog, let's see, Joby White, Al-Shaheed Muhammad, you have Q-Tip, you know what? Yeah, and another band that I think that they toured with, Arrested Development, right? So these were bands in many ways. Like, they were doing the work in the studio themselves, but also going on tour, oftentimes with more than just a DJ, for example. So here's a great quote. It was listening to NWA straight out of Compton that inspired us to make the low end theory, says Q-Tip. Years later, I spoke to Dr. Dre, and he told me that hearing the low end theory inspired him to make the Chronic. That makes absolutely perfect sense. So you had this energy that came out of NWA, and they took it somewhere else, just in their vocal stylings and their musical choices. But just some of the, the key songs you have, like Scenario, Bugging Out, I Left My Wallet in El Segundo, Jazz, We've Got It. Really, really good. And I think warranted to be a nominee of a Hall of Fame. But it must be considered that now hip hop is firmly part of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, this goes back to the whole Run DMC first said a DJ could be a band mentality, and also bands like Public Enemy, who found themselves, I guess, strange bedfellows with bands like Primus and Anthrax. So very much rooted in rock and roll culture as much as they are firmly hip hop. So A Tribe Called Quest, right out of the gate, not necessarily directly rock and roll. So the next artist is, I'm not into this artist. It's just my own musical tastes, but she's certainly seen a huge resurgence thanks to a show called Stranger Things. I'm talking about Kate Bush. I wasn't really interested in Kate Bush then. I'm not really now, but I also understand kind of the space that she occupies and why that's very attractive to many people. And many young people heard that running up that hill, and as my daughter said, that song's a banger. I think she said it's low-key a banger. But, hey, Kate Bush, congrats on your nomination. So a little bit more in my wheelhouse as far as performance goes. Next is Sheryl Crow. Now, Sheryl Crow is also interesting in the fact that she does, I guess she crosses over many different genre lines. And the fact that she started out as Michael Jackson's background singer into becoming a very strong solo act, I think it's really impressive. But I mean, most people think about, songs like All I Want to Do, but I mean, she had a number of hits. Strong Enough, If It Makes You Happy, Every Day is a Winding Road, Soak Up the Sun, First Cut is the Deepest. I mean, she's really quite good. And I think that she has certainly earned this nomination. But, it's also interesting to see here that throughout her career, Sheryl Crow has collaborated with some of the biggest names in rock and country. Keith Richards, Prince, Johnny Cash, and Loretta Lynn, just to name a few. But she was also writing. So as much as she was a background singer and a session musician, she was also writing songs for Celine Dion, Tina Turner, and Winona Judd. So, I mean, a triple threat. Singer, musician, songwriter. Very, very impressive. So kudos to Sheryl Crow. So let's see. Next on the list. So here we have, again, more like hip hop. And it's so interesting to think that she's even old enough to have met the criteria. I go, holy cow. Yeah, she really has been. And I'm talking about Missy Misdemeanor Elliott. Get your freak on. Get your freak on. I mean, she's just an indomitable force of will who was occupying a place that was relatively untapped by and large. And that certainly women in hip hop have certainly not always been given the same kind of cred that their, male counterparts. I mean, of course, people will look at, someone like, MC Lyte, right? MC Lyte was a groundbreaker, and of course, Salt and Peppa. But it was an artist like Missy Elliott that really pushed the boundaries. And I think it's interesting how it's described here. Futuristic production with jarring distortions, and this is the word I use, right? Inimitable rap style. She would spit out onomatopoeic nonsense, sing-song, and jagged syncopations in a signature urban Southern drawl. Very, very good. So beyond just, get your freak on. Yeah, the rain, super duper fly. She's a bitch. Work it. Lose control. And then, of course, WTF with Pharrell. Certainly, I can't displace her impact. But again, I'm a hip hop fan. I just wish there was like a legit hip hop Hall of Fame, or maybe it shouldn't be the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame anymore. It should be the Recording Industry Hall of Fame, right? I guess that's somewhat limiting because there are some bands that have really made their bones as live acts, and maybe that isn't fair because maybe, there are some artists. I think of the Grateful Dead, right? They do have records, of course they do, and some classic records. But really, their bread and butter was live performance and touring. But that makes them equally important. So, performing industry Hall of Fame? I don't know. I mean, I know that now they just call it the rap wing of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I guess that's fine. But certainly, Missy Elliott. So far, other than Kate Bush, I'm not sure she really had the impact. And if I'm wrong about that, let me know in the comments or shoot me an email. Because I never got into her. So next, in my opinion, supremely deserving, and of course, in their own style, completely dismissive of the potential nomination. And that is Iron Maiden. Now, you don't have, your Metallicas. Think about your big four. I don't think they exist without Iron Maiden any more than I think they would exist without punk rock. They wouldn't exist without Black Flag, right? So they are called the blueprint for how heavy metal bands should look and sound, and certainly tour. And at this point, they're a 3-guitar band because you have all the guitarists that have had their careers with Iron Maiden in the band together, right? So it's Dave Murray, Adrian Smith, and, oh gosh, don't forget his name. Wait a minute. They do not have him listed? Yannick Gears. How did I not remember? Oh my gosh. So all the nominees. So this is cool. Okay, this is really cool. So Paul Di'Anno is the original singer of Iron Maiden. And many people will say that the band is great regardless of whether it was Bruce Dickinson or not, right? But it's Clive Burr, original drummer, Paul Di'Anno, Bruce Dickinson, Yannick Gers, Steve Harris on bass, Nickel McBrain on drums, Dave Murray, Adrian Smith on guitar, and hold on a second. I guess I don't know my lore as well as I should, huh? Oh, Dennis Stratton, original guitar player for Iron Maiden. Okay, so yeah, I've never listened to Iron Maiden, like the debut album, Iron Maiden. I think the first album that I was interested in, which I guess like purists. So I didn't really listen to them except for like Somewhere in Time. But in particular, like I look at my album, my Maiden album is Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. I think it's a great record. And I think in part because within this context of heavy metal, British heavy metal, they have such a sense of melody, and I think it's sometimes lost. So I personally, my favorite song by Iron Maiden, and all the purists can go boo all they want, Can I Play With Madness is a brilliant pop song. I've said it on the podcast before. It's a brilliant pop song with a great hook, a great melody. I think that's forgotten sometime, that they're a band that they're not thrash metal, you know, they're just heavy metal. And of course, Bruce Dickinson, holy cow, the pipes on that guy, absolutely amazing. Very well deserved. But Bruce Dickinson and the boys have basically said, it's arbitrary and meaningless, and we're not really interested in induction. We'll see when the time comes. I would like to think that maybe the band would get together and say, you know, this is an honor. But I think they're like many saying, but what is the criteria at this point? And maybe they would look at the next band and some of the perhaps liberties that the Hall has taken of combining two bands into one. So we have Joy Division and New Order. Now, in my opinion, these are two very distinctly different bands. And the big piece of that is because of Ian Curtis. I really, really love Joy Division. Love it. And I am much more ambivalent to New Order, right? They're different bands, you know? They're just different bands. And it's great to see the nomination recognizing the history, though. If you haven't listened to Joy Division and you don't know songs like Love Will Tear Us Apart or She's Lost Control, then you have to go and listen. They're just so good. And I admittedly didn't get it immediately. But then a buddy of mine let me borrow the CD. And I just really began to listen to what was going on. I think part of it was because I knew they had become New Order. And that was not something that I was really into. So I kind of dismissed it a little bit. But then I began to listen to the lyrics. And, you know, journalist John Savage once described Curtis's lyrics as the underlying reality of a society in turmoil, with Curtis's deep vocals on these lines, braced by cutting guitars mixed with melodic bass lines and echoing drum sounds, transformed the emotional into the physical. Holy cow. Yeah, you will be transported if you sit down and just listen to the album in isolation with your headphones on. It is a journey. And he was 22 years old when he committed suicide, right before they were going to have their first big U.S. tour. Such a tragedy, such a tragedy. But well-deserved. I do think it's interesting to say that, Joy Division, New Order together, but I do understand why. Now, the next artist, I will tell you, I absolutely believe is rock and roll and deserves to be fully right in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And that's Cyndi Lauper. I mean, she is a little bit of everything, to be perfectly honest. So it makes perfect sense to me. And I'm not even going to, I realize I'm already going long with what I had planned for this evening. Well, you said you didn't play in. Well, I did play in some. Yeah, I will tell you that I guess about, it's probably 10 years ago. Gosh, I don't even think, probably more than that. It's probably close to like 18 years. And just flipping through the channels, I may have even said this before on the podcast, and there was one of those PBS concerts, and it was Cyndi Lauper live from the small club in New York. And for those who don't know, she'd had major voice and vocal cord issues. She essentially had to learn how to sing all over again. And holy cow, did she bring it in this performance. You know, this mixture of her ridiculous, corny humor, but that is braced up against this instrument that is her voice. Love Cyndi Lauper. Love Cyndi Lauper. And it's everything that she's done. It's not just, necessarily the hits. So, of course, she had a huge hit with her version of When You Were Mine, which she performed on the American Music Awards. Killed it. And that's a Prince song, of course. But you just look at the discography. Girls Just Want to Have Fun, Time After Time, She Bop, all through the night. Oh my gosh. I love that song so much. True Colors, Change of Heart, I Drove All Night. But then, like, complete little ridiculous corny gems, like There's a Hole in My Heart that goes all the way to China. I mean, what a career. What a legend. And has certainly influenced generations of not just female artists, but just artists in general that love good music. Completely well-deserved, firmly a rock and roll choice. Now, the next one, again, it's hard to not a rock artist at all. Like, at all. Completely pop or R&B, no matter which way you slice it. But, without a doubt, probably one of the top 5 singers ever. And I'm talking like technically, like the ability to actually sing with, everyone ages, but at his height with a seeming effortlessness and hitting some crazy, crazy notes. And I'm talking about, yet again, gone too soon, George Michael. There is the part of me that maybe I'm wrong. I don't think that Wham has been inducted. So there's a little bit of me is like poor Andrew Ridgeley, but he became the most played artist on British radio from 1984 to 2004. I mean, holy cow. Such an amazing singer. So he leaves Wham, where he already has huge hits. Wake Me Up Before You Go Go, Last Christmas, Careless Whisper, right? He releases that Faith album. Faith was a #1 smash, boasting 4 hit singles, including the title track and Father Figure. But, I mean, gosh, what a singer. Like that, his cover of Elton John, So Let the Sun Go Down on Me. Just sublime. What a amazing performer. What an amazing performer. And just kind of an interesting biography and just, I guess, the journey that he was on as a person. Just, the trials and tribulations and how, regardless of fame, these are just people. Just people. Now, the next one might make you say, how come he's not already in the Hall of Fame? If you already know that country artists have been nominated and inducted, why the hell isn't Willie Nelson already in? Can someone tell me that? Someone. How is this possible? Now, let me just tell you something right now. Willie Nelson did a kids record And I don't even think they list it in his discography or his key hits. His cover of Rainbow Connection is amazing. It is so beautifully Willie Nelson. And the guy is just a legend. But then you think about like that 80s crossover, right? You're Always on My Mind. What was the song with Enrique Iglesias? All the Girls I've Loved Before. I mean, he was also for lack of a better term, pop artist, right? A contemporary artist, and not just the things that he did as a purely country artist. Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. On the Road Again. Come on. Whiskey River. How is Willie Nelson not already in the Rock Hall? The guy has been playing music for 60 plus years. Willie Nelson was born in 1933. Think about that. But he probably didn't notice. He was probably too stoned and, well, I'm not already in. So Willie Nelson deserves to be in all the Hall of Fames. All of them. Just induct him into all the Hall of Fames. So now we start getting into the next two bands. So like Tribe Called Quest are firmly our bands. And what's interesting is directly related, if you know their career trajectories. So first and foremost, we have Rage Against the Machine. Of course, I guess you can call it post-hardcore, because obviously, well, not obviously if you don't know, but, Zach De La Rocha was in, some hardcore bands. He was in Inside Out with Porcell from Shelter, the Krishna Core stuff. You have Tom Morello, who is an innovator of, how do they call it? Rap rock hybridization, using pedals, toggle switches, and alternate tunings to incorporate effects normally created by hip-hop turntables. Absolutely. You have Tim Comerford on bass, and honestly, to me, like specifically for Rage Against the Machine, Brad Wilk is the right drummer for Rage Against the Machine. I don't think some of the other things that he's done, he's always quite been up to the challenge. Black Sabbath, I'm sorry, weak. You just, so this is a well-deserved, nomination, so I don't want to pick on Brad Wilk. But what's curious is that many of us in middle age, I think, and this comes up frequently, particularly when Tom Morello takes to social media to engage in political discourse, which we all have the right to do. And he sometimes takes particular stances of not understanding why certain people might relate to Rage Against the Machine. But what's interesting is that, when you look at it, the band members gave a voice to the powerless, calling out local and global inequalities and railing against censorship, corporate cronyism, and government overreach. That, to me, is not a left or right thing. When you read that, that's why I think they have, whether they realize it or not, transcended lines. Because if, some of the things that they have said and embodied, I think are much more of a shared American experience than not. And I think that's where sometimes things get missed. But you look at the hits: Killing in the Name, Bullet in the Head, Bomb Track. Yo, it's just another bomb track, and suckers been thinking that they can fake this. Bulls on Parade. That killer riff. Oh my gosh. People of the Sun, Testify. I mean, good stuff. I have never sweat more at a concert than Rage Against the Machine. Never. Now, I've told the story on the episode about Lollapalooza. It was also during Rage Against the Machine set that I, with a freshly pierced nose, got an elbow right to the face. Ouch. Right in the brand new piercing. Hurt like hell. But then I got to see them, in other occasions. And, dripping sweat from head to toe. Just having such a blast. Such a blast. Now, I'm not saying like I was like in the dead center of the pit or anything, but because some of the boys would go a little bit overboard, and I was never particularly interested in, taking elbows to the face. Wasn't my idea of fun, but I still definitely, got my slam on, but completely well-deserved. And, they really, like Faith No More, definitely influence, whether they like it or not, kind of new metal and the rap rock hybrid. But that's where the next band shares a lineage, and not even a lineage, I guess. Well, I guess it is. Lineage goes either forwards or backwards, right? And that is Seattle's own Soundgarden. So, of course, the overlap between the bands is the post-Soundgarden, post-Rage Against the Machine grouping of Chris Cornell, along with the three members, non-singing, so without Zach, members of Rage Against the Machine, created Audioslave. So, these two bands, Soundgarden came out much earlier, probably almost a decade earlier, on Sub Pop Records. I mentioned, they did that tour with like Voivod. Voivod was the headliner. They were in the second slot, Faith No More opening. And that's like 89, right? So yeah, Louder Than Love, was their first like big record on a major label. But Bad Motorfinger, Super Unknown was their biggest, 6-time platinum. But Rusty Cage, Outshined, is so killer. Black Hole Sun, Spoon Man, Burden in My Head, Pretty Noose. Oh my gosh. Pretty Noose is an amazing song. Blow Up the Outside World. Matt Cameron, Chris Cornell, Ben Shepherd, Kim Thale, Hiro Yamamoto. They are, this is my opinion only, okay? People can agree, disagree, it's fine. To me, there's only two grunge bands. There's Alice in Chains and Soundgarden, because they're firmly in the metal world per se. But when I hear the word grunge, what do I hear? I hear Outshined. Dun, 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 dun. That dun, 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 dun. That's just the sound. That embodies grunge to me. More so than Nirvana or Pearl Jam. To me, it's Alice in Chains and Soundgarden occupying a place that's uniquely their own. Because they're not metal per se, but they're not like Pearl Jam, and they're not punk like Nirvana, because I call Nirvana more punk than anything. Soundgarden and Alice in Chains, unique giants amongst men. So nothing but love for Chris Cornell, and I wish he could have found another way. So now we're jumping backwards in time again. And here's another completely appropriate nomination when you consider some of the other bands that would have come out of Motown that are already in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. We're talking about the Spinners. So, could it be I'm Falling in Love, One of a Kind, Working My Way Back to You, Forgive Me Girl, Henry Fambro, Billy Henderson, Purvis Jackson, Bobby Smith, Felipe Wynn, the Spinners. I mean, the whole Motown phenomenon, for lack of a better term, you know, everyone was killing it on the charts. Like everyone. And it just seems like another artist would get signed and just run up the charts. I mean, really doing no wrong at that time. So kudos. I definitely think they are appropriate. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the Delphonics are already in. I think the Jackson 5 is already in. So a number of bands that are coming out of that Detroit Motown scene are already in. I believe the Supremes are in. So Spinners, it's probably long overdue, to be perfectly honest with you. And then we have two more here. Again, I feel old to think that they've been around long enough. And, yeah, they have been. Wow. So, the White Stripes, Jack and Meg. They were formed in 1997, but had their biggest break in 2002. But they released 3 blues-inspired albums on Sympathy for the Record Industry label, indie label, and then 2002, White Blood Cells. And then you have their first proper, as they put it, major label debut, not a re-release, which is Elephant. I mean, Just Seven Nation Army fell in love with a girl, right? Icky Thump. This is as stripped down and raw as you can imagine. I mean, just the two of them against the world. A guitar that also seemed like it was the bass, and a really simple, raw, just setting the tempo drum out of Meg. It was everything that you needed, and it was perfect for the time in which it was released. And there was a few other bands around that time that were coming out, bands like the Strokes and stuff like that, that were kind of these throwbacks through a bygone era. Like I said, a little bit punky, but also kind of, you know, they say here, garage rock and like a blues foundation. Because it kind of got away from blues at various different times in rock music, where it'll go to like neoclassical styles and like different scales and all those kind of things. But this is as stripped down and straightforward as possible. It is a regular recommendation of mine on the show that if you haven't seen It Might Get Loud, the documentary with Jack White, the Edge from U2, and Jimmy Page talking about guitar, I highly recommend it. It is an amazing, amazing journey. And now, the last nomination, which from everything I've heard was requested by multiple members of the media and the music community. Now that I think about it, I guess I'm surprised he wasn't already in. So I'm talking about Warren Zevon. So I think people think of it, or think of him as being jokey, right? But it's really more wit, like dry wit. Yes, there's some overt humor, but ultimately, he also wrote some very thoughtful and beautiful music. And I think that most people kind of think of Werewolves of London, right? Lawyers, guns, and money, stuff like that. But there's a song. Oh, gosh. So anyone who doesn't know, Warren Zevon knew that he was dying. And there's a song on there. I always forget the title. Let's see here. Keep Me in Your Heart. It's the closing track. And when you look at it in the context of someone who is dying, it's really quite beautiful. So none of the humor, or as they put it, acerbic wit. But I'm just going to read the lyrics to this song. So for anyone who doesn't know Warren Zevon, now I will admit, I don't know all of his discography, and sometimes I've learned of it from the strangest things. Like Carmelita, I learned because of Gigi Allen. I mean, what a weird freaking thing to learn. Is Carmelita? No, Carmelita's the boss, right? Or did he do a cover of it? All right, hold on. Now I'm second-guessing myself here. Yeah, Carmelita. Warren Zevon. I don't know why I was like second-guessing myself here. Ha! And there it is. These include a folk version by infamous punk rocker Gigi Allen. So my memory does still somewhat function. But here are the lyrics to Keep Me in Your Heart. And I suggest you go listen to it. Shadows are falling and I'm running out of breath. Keep me in your heart for a while. If I leave you, it doesn't mean I love you any less. Keep me in your heart for a while. When you get up in the morning and you see that crazy sun, keep me in your heart for a while. There's a train leaving nightly called When It's All Said and Done. Keep me in your heart for a while. And I mean, it just goes on. Sometimes when you're doing simple things around the house, maybe you'll think of me and smile. You know I'm tied to you like the buttons on your blouse. Keep me in your heart for a while. Hold me in your thoughts. Take me to your dreams. Touch me as I fall into view. When the winter comes, keep the fires lit, and I'll be right next to you. Engine drivers headed north to Pleasant Street. Keep me in your heart for a while. These wheels keep turning, but they're running out of steam. Keep me in your heart for a while. That is the closing number on his last album that he wrote with full awareness that his time on Earth was almost to an end. So I'm going to say for myself and for all of you listening, check out a little Warren Zevon. That last album, I haven't listened to the whole thing. I've listened to bits and pieces, and that closing number gets me every time. But if there is someone on this list who is deserving to be in, like yesterday, Warren Zevon, then Willie Nelson, absolutely deserved. So, I'd started... Well, actually, just let me know your thoughts on the Hall and what it means, and should it be just considered a music Hall of Fame at this point? Just curious what your thoughts are. But this episode turned out to be less about just random musical musings and more about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Because I did have a couple of other things that were happening in music that were directly related to our generation. But at this point, we'll save that for another episode. We'll save that for another episode as we're up against the time here tonight, or today, or whenever it is that you're listening to this podcast. So what are your thoughts about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? And do you think that there are some acts that have been nominated that are not at all worthy of the nomination, much less a potential induction? Love to know your thoughts. So please email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at StuckPodX. Head on over to the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. Please like, comment, leave 5-star reviews, share, and most importantly, please subscribe to the podcast. So, until next time, later, slackers.